Hey there. Welcome to this session of SQLConf 2025. My name is Chris Wiederspan, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about this combination of Data API Builder and Azure Container Apps. As you know, Data API Builder is great for taking our databases and then exposing that data out through a set of APIs. And Data API Builder, or DAB as we call it, is really fantastic at making that super easy. I can kind of just declaratively say what data I want to expose, whether I want it to be read only or read write. I can declare permissions around that, and it really is fantastic. On the flip side, we've got Azure Container Apps. This is a platform as a service offering within Azure. It makes it super simple to take a container image, spin it up, expose it out to the world if that's my goal. And I don't have all that overhead of something like Kubernetes or the learning curve that comes with that. It really is meant to be easy, quick, simple to manage. And we take care of all the scalability aspects of that, the deployment aspects, blue-green deployments and things like that. So when you take both of those technologies and you kind of glue them together, you come up with a nice, compelling solution that makes it really easy to build and deploy APIs for your applications. Before we jump in, let me just introduce myself and tell you a little bit about my job. My name is Chris Wiederspan. I work here at Microsoft. I'm an Azure App Innovation Specialist. I always describe my job as helping customers build and run their apps in the cloud. I spend my days talking to customers about things like containers, Kubernetes, Azure Platform as a Service. We talk a lot about DevOps, platform engineering, infrastructure as code. We also spend time talking to our customers about developer productivity. How do you make your developers more productive with things like GitHub Copilot? How do you structure your teams to get maximum efficiency out of them and your processes? But that's enough about me. Let's jump in and get started. I've got the next 30 minutes broken up into these three topics. The first one, design and development. We're going to talk a little bit about using DAB locally. If you're familiar with this term, inner loop, that kind of refers to the work that I, as a developer, am doing locally on my own machine. That process of building out code, or in this case, building out my DAB config file, which makes up my data API builder APIs. But I need to be able to run that, test it, iterate on it, fix things, all that kind of stuff. So we'll talk about that. But I don't want to just talk about that in the context of local development. I really want to focus on this theme of containerization. How do I do that with containers? And specifically, we're going to use two different containers. One is a container that's running SQL Server. It's got a sample database loaded into it. That'll kind of serve as the API backdrop. So that'll have our data that we're going to expose. We'll be able to test it. And the other one is our actual data API builder application. So as we build that config file, we're going to put it inside of a container and test it out. And once we have that container, we'll do things like push it up to a container registry so we can use it on Azure. Speaking of Azure, we'll go ahead and deploy a SQL Azure database. We'll use that same sample database we used in our local container, and we will deploy the Azure Container App. We'll give it a connection string to our database, and then we'll use our container image that we're going to download to actually run the application. Luckily, that's just about it in terms of the slides I have for you today. I do have a GitHub repo though, and pretty much everything I'm going to do today and show you is coming from this aka.ms/dab-aca URL. You can see the actual URL down below, but this is just a GitHub repo I have on my account. It's got all the files that we're going to use. It's got the commands that we're going to execute in the README file. So please go check that out, especially if you want to follow along and kind of do some of this on your own. So here I am in the repo inside the GitHub website. You'll notice this is not a overly sophisticated application or demo. There's really only a couple folders, a couple Docker related files, some configuration files. We will talk through all of that once we get this up and running. The one thing I do want to call out here is that I'm going to use GitHub code spaces to run this. The one file that's relevant to that is in the .dev container folder, and then there's a dev container.json file. This really just lays out the groundwork for my containerized development environment. So in this case, I'm using kind of just the generic base image from GitHub. I'm also instructing it to load the Azure CLI, uh, .NET I need in there for the DAB stuff. And then I'm telling it to pre-install a couple of extensions that may be useful along the way. But since I've got that, I can go ahead and click this big green button. And then within there, you can see I actually already have a code space running. All I need to do is click that and say, open up in Visual Studio Code. I'm going to do that in the desktop version of VS Code. Okay, so here I am in VS Code running this repo in my container. I'll probably keep saying locally, but when I say locally, I just mean inside of code spaces. Now, this is the README file that we saw before. The idea here is that we've outlined several steps that we can take to kind of reproduce the development environment that we're looking for. And the idea is that we are looking to do things like iterate with our code locally. That's that inner loop that any good developer loves to maintain an efficient process. You don't want to have to push code up to the cloud every time you want to test it. So that inner loop is important. And to get started with that, you do need to set up a couple environment variables. I'm not going to get into all of these. There is this sample.env file. You'll notice I have my own .env already copied over, and it's updated with a couple secrets. Most notably, I had to create a Docker pat token that connects me to my Docker Hub account, which is where ultimately we're going to push some images and pull some images from. So I need a security token for that. Everything else is kind of just made up, including like this dummy SA password. We'll talk about where that gets used. My tenant ID and subscription ID are just GUIDs. They're not really secrets. So nothing to hide there. But we need to have that env file. And once we do, we can come in here down to our terminal that's running in our code space. And we can just say source.env. And that loads up our environment variables. And just to kind of prove that out, if I do, so I'm going to echo out what my location variable is. You can see I've got that set to West US 2. Okay, so now we're back in the README file. We've kind of taken on this prerequisites step, and we're good to go with our variables there. This is where we kind of get into that inner loop development process. We want to do that in a way that's friendly to the container theme that we're working on here. And so we're going to use some local Docker containers. That is Docker and Docker. If you're familiar with kind of code spaces and how you can run Docker within a Docker container, but that's subject for another day. But one thing we can do is we can start running some of these containers. And the two containers that I have of interest, and I'm going to pop open the Docker compose file. There are two containers defined in here. One is a SQL container that is actually running SQL Server inside of a Linux container. You can come and check out another repo that I've got that shows where I build that image and how I restore the database. But it's going to restore the AdventureWorks LT database. That is a sample database that you can get online. You can download or restore it into SQL Server. It's just a jumping off point for us for illustrative purposes. But it's nice. It works with DAB fairly straightforwardly. Okay, so that is my SQL container. There's some health check stuff here. We're not going to get into that too much other than the health check simply makes sure that my database server is actually up and running, that my database has finished restoring, and that's when it gives the all clear that the health check is good. That matters because I don't want to start the second container until that first container is done. This depends on. And for clarity, my second container is the actual data API builder application. We'll talk about where that's coming from here in a minute. But for the time being, what I really want to do is I just want to kick off that SQL container. And so I can use this Docker compose command. And I can run that. That went quick because I've already run that before. You'll notice it exposes port 1433. Because I'm using code spaces, it uses a nice little proxy utility to expose that to my actual physical laptop that I'm running on. And if I want to, I can prove that out. I can come over here to I've already got my password saved in there, but I'm just connected to local port or my local machine, which is proxying up to GitHub code spaces. I can say connect. As you can see, I have that AdventureWorks database available, ready to go. It has a few tables in there and things that we can then connect our DAB implementation to. Okay, so now that we've got a SQL container up and running, this is the actual development work that we're talking about. So this is you as the developer being able to run the .NET tools like Data API Builder and initialize that. When I initialize that, it's going to create a file called dabconfig.json. Now, in our repo, we've got a file already called final-dab-config.json. That is essentially what you would get if you ran all of these commands. In fact, it should be identical to that output. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to rename this file here and get that final out of there. And then we can use this file moving forward. All right. Now that we have that file, let's go ahead and run the rest of our application. So you remember our Docker compose file. I've already got this container running just to show you that. If I do a Docker PS, I can see that I'm running that AdventureWorks Docker file. So let's go ahead and add the next piece of that. And we'll let it build our Docker file. And run our container. So that was pretty quick. You'll notice it's exposing port 5000. But let's go look at what that Docker file actually is. This is really kind of the key point of this whole session, is that this is not hard to run a data API builder application inside of a container. It is literally 2 lines of code inside of a Docker file. The first one is just using the kind of official Microsoft data API builder image that we publish. And then I am just jamming my dab config file into the app folder there. And then again, for my Docker compose file, this is that application. You can see I'm exposing port 5000. I'm executing the Docker build. So this dot here just gives it the context, which resolves to this Docker file. And then I do have to pass in a database connection string. So this is the connection string that my application container will use to connect to my database container. You'll notice the server name for this is just SQL, which maps up to this label for that image. And if I come over here, let's just pop open another terminal window, Docker PS again, you will see that I am running two different containers. So that is how those two will talk to each other. That is how the DAB container will reference the SQL server that's connecting to that same database that we've been talking about, the AdventureWorks LT. And this is one of those environment variables that I had in my .env file. So you can see I set the password on the SQL container, and then I embed that password inside of an environment variable, which is getting set into the application container. And that's how I can do all of this stuff without, for example, checking in a secret into my connection string. Now, if I want to test this, there's this cool utility in VS Code. It's one of the extensions. It's called the REST client. It's really great for helping you test out your local APIs or any APIs for that matter. In my case, I've got to connect to localhost port 5000. That's that port that we're exposing because our code spaces is using that proxy to expose port 5000. We should be able to get to that. And then this .http file that we're looking at, it has the capability to do things like variable substitutions. It's got a nice little templating syntax, and it lets me do things like send a request to my local application and get back data. So I'm actually here kind of doing a test against the entire application that's running locally inside of my environment. No cloud resources at this point. Everything's just happening right here within the code space. So at this point, we've kind of built out a local inner loop development process. We've talked about how our Docker file makes this possible to containerize our application. We've talked about using the Docker Compose file to kind of stitch that together into an entire working local version. Now let's go ahead and put this container up in the cloud. So I'm going to come back over to my README file. We're kind of moving on to this topic 2, containerization. I need to switch my thing back. I'll go ahead and close out my Docker Compose, let those containers unwind. Okay, so that's done. Clear that up. So here's what we're going to do next. We're going to log into, in my case, I'm using Docker Hub. There's certainly more probably sophisticated and secure ways to do this. In my case, I don't really care if these images are up there publicly available. There's no secrets in there. They're just for illustrative purposes and makes the demo a little bit easier. So I've logged into Docker, and my next step is, again, I'm going to use that Docker file, and I'm going to build this container image. That went fast. I already had all the parts there for that. And if I, Docker image list, you can see now that I've got a Wiederspan AdventureWorks DAB latest tag. That's the one I just built. It says 6 minutes ago. It's just because that's byte for byte the same image that we already have. So it's essentially just relabeling it. And just for completeness, you'll notice this bigger image is that SQL image that I was running. It's a little bigger. It's been around for 6 days when I started working on this, and it is already local. Okay. Final step here is I want to get this Docker image up to my Docker Hub account. So I'm pushing it up there. Pretty much, again, already exists just because I've done this before. Show you my repositories. You'll notice that image, same one we just pushed up 1 minute ago, is now up in the cloud. And what we want to do now is we want to be able to deploy some Azure resources and actually load that container up, run it inside an environment, have an Azure-based SQL instance of our database. That would equate to our prod instance, for example. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to look at this bicep file. Bicep is just Azure's native infrastructure as code language. It's kind of layered on top of ARM templates, if you're familiar with that. But it makes it a little bit easier, kind of roughly akin to the way Terraform works. So I've got 4 different variables I can pass in, or parameters I can pass into my bicep file. The first thing I'm going to create is a managed user identity. That managed user identity will be used to run the container app. So the container app will run in the context of that user, and will also assign that user the admin permissions, the SQL admin permissions on our database. We'll see that here in just a second. Second thing we're going to do, we got a few kind of infrastructure-y things. We're going to use the log analytics workspace. We're going to use app insights. Those are things that our Azure Container App will actually wire up to, but for the sake of today's discussion, I'm just going to breeze over those. Here's where we're going to actually install the SQL Server, or set up the SQL Server. So we're using the location that we've designated. We pass that variable all the way through from our .env file up to our commands that are going to execute the bicep. You'll notice I am, from a security standpoint, I'm using Active Directory as my authentication mechanism for that SQL Server, and I am gluing it to that managed identity that I created above, which in effect is making that the SQL admin over the entire database. I'm not using real best practices here. I'm not clamping down on firewall rules. I'm not using virtual networks like I should. In the real world, obviously, I'd have a lot more security baked into this. Here's my database itself. So this part of the reason we're using this AdventureWorks LT database is because in SQL Azure, that's one of the databases that I can use as a sample. And just by setting this property this way, it will automatically restore that same database that we used locally, or I shouldn't say the same database. It will restore an identical copy of that database into the SQL Azure database. And then we get into the actual container environment. I'm not going to get too much into the Azure Container App overview, other than if you're familiar with ACA or Azure Container Apps, there's an environment that's kind of your platform as a whole that you're creating inside of Azure. We're doing things like connecting that log analytics workspace. We're connecting the application insights. Those are for observability's sake. And then this is the actual application itself that's getting installed on that platform, or spun up on that platform with our container. Again, from a security standpoint, this is where we're connecting that to our managed user identity. So this container app will run as that user, which inherently means that it is going to have access to the SQL Server. Again, target port 5000. That's what we need to access this app to expose it out. And as you would expect, we are also setting that database connection string environment variable. This time we're wiring up the server to our SQL server that we created up above. And we're just using the bicep mechanism to put that SQL server inside the connection string. We're telling you which database to connect to. In this case, that's that AdventureWorks LT. We are telling it that our user ID is that managed user identity. But you'll notice nowhere in here is there any password. That is the beauty of the managed identities. They don't require passwords. Azure takes care of all that under the covers, and you don't risk storing passwords and connection strings or checking them into your repo or just having them get out there in the world. So, really nice security uh, in that sake. The only thing I will call out is I've got an output URL. This is where I'm actually going to output the URL for the container app that we're using. We'll use that to then plug back into our test file and actually run that. So let's get going on this. So I'm back here in my README file. I'm already logged in. I don't need to do that again. I will go ahead and create a group. So this is creating the resource group inside of Azure. So that's done. So now you'll see I've got an empty resource group, nothing in there because I haven't done my bicep file yet. Let's go do that now. This is the command, the AZ deployment group create, where I'm passing in my bicep file. And then I'm passing along those variables that we've kind of talked about throughout. Let's grab that. This will take a minute. So we'll kick that off. All right. So you can see that that finished. If we come over here to back to my Azure portal, you'll see I've now got all those resources in there. And I can find that output, which is this thing here. I can copy that. And if we come back to our testing file again, and I just replace my old value in there with the new value. So this will allow me to test against this newly deployed infrastructure that's running up in Azure. It's going to just run the health check, get a nice 200 there. If I query my customers, I get, as expected, all that customer data. Same thing with all of my other queries that I can run. So we're in good shape. We now have built a container. We've built our DAB configuration. We've pushed all that up to Azure, and we now have our application up and running. I do want to call out one more file in this repo. It's in the GitHub folder under the workflows folder called pipeline.yaml. This is a GitHub action file. It really just ties everything together. So references a few variables and secrets. It does the Docker push. It does the Azure bicep deployment, effectively deploying your app to Azure, and it just pieces everything together. There is some documentation here in the README file under this topic 4 that gives you what you need to set up your secrets and your variables using the GitHub CLI. We talk about where you get the Azure credentials and how those fit in. And then when you're done, just use this cleanup section to tidy up and remove all the resources that you created as part of the demo. Well, time flies when you're having fun, as the old saying goes. Here are a couple links that you can use to dig in a little bit deeper to the technologies that we talked through today. I had a great time making this and learning all of this stuff on my side. So I hope there's some tidbits you can take away as you work through these on your own. I also want to mention that the Microsoft Learn website has some great free resources that you can use to learn about SQL-related technologies and really anything else Microsoft related. Again, it's free. Please take advantage. There's a ton of great content there. But that's it for me. I'm out of time. I really appreciate you spending your time here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions.